Well, I had the opportunity earlier today to attend the PKF Africa conference, and it was a gathering of about 120 of the Africa and some global leaders. And it was great to be part of the room, but I had an opportunity to gain some insight into their business. But also for me, it's really about that partnering, about how stakeholders matter. And if I look at some of the other attendees as well from their network, really emphasizing this need for collaboration across ecosystems and how much partnerships matter. And a lot of what we focused on, or what they focused on, was around value and value creation. And from a financier perspective, obviously, having a very close relationship with accounting firms, with audit firms and advisors is really crucial. But also ultimately from that two perspectives, we're ultimately also servicing the same clients. And again, if our clients do well, we do well. And this was really a core theme that stood out for me, which ended up being, I guess, around stewardship. Um, so what I want to briefly do is just touch on. I won't repeat the kind of exact conversations that we did have, just because it was a closed room. But I do think the opportunity that I had to share some insights with the group around South Africa, around Africa, around growth prospects, but then also about funding and funding structures. I think there's a lot of cross learning that can take place. So what I want to do is just briefly touch on an edited version of that, which I think will also have a broader appeal. Um, I started off the conversation by really just again recognizing the African opportunity and this value creation opportunity that does exist. Um, really focused around, if we're talking about Africa's future, we're not just speaking about an abstract idea, but we're talking about businesses being built, entrepreneurs creating markets, institutions being tested, capital allocated, jobs being created, and trust being earned. Often in environments that are complex, demanding, and of course at times also underpriced in one sense and overpriced in another. And what I highlighted to the group as well, I joined them kind of as a financier, as a banker, but also as having a solid grounding in accounting, and then also with my professional life shaped from the worlds of learning and leadership and stewardship through a lot of the work that I do with Said Business School and also SEMA and ICEPA. And across the board, one of the key questions that often comes up is how do institutions really create durable value in a world that's becoming more fragmented, more selective, and more difficult to read? And this question matters everywhere, of course, but I would want to suggest that this is specifically relevant for Africa, because Africa today really sits at this intersection of some of the biggest forces reshaping the global economy, changing trade orders, repricing risks, more selective capital environment, rapid technology disruption, pressure on public assets, and balance sheets, and this growing premium on resilience, governance, and institutional quality. We saw in January the IMF still projecting global growth at around 3%, which again tells us the world economy is still moving, but it's moving through divergence, fragmentation, uncertainty, not simply through ease, and easy confidence. And of course, this matters for Africa because Africa is increasingly being judged not only on its promise, but on its credibility, not only on its demographics, but on its investability, not only on whether opportunities exist, but whether that opportunity can be translated into trust, um, structured and outcomes. So the question for Africa is not simply where there's opportunity. There is. It's also not simply whether there's risk. We know there's risk. The real question is whether we are getting better at understanding the relationship between the two, whether we are getting better at separating perceived risk from actual risk, whether we're building the institutions, the systems, the capabilities, the partnerships needed to turn this potential into investability. Because, again, Africa is still too often described through extremes. On the one side, there's the language of fragility, debt pressure, currency volatility, infrastructure gaps, policy inconsistency, governance weakness, political risk. And on the other end, there's this language of promise, young population, urbanization, digital adoption, entrepreneurial growth, untapped markets, energy demand, and regional trade potential. And both narratives contain truth. But neither is enough on its own, because Africa, again, is not a slogan. It's not one market. It's not one risk profile. It's not one growth story. It's a continent of contrast, of unevenness, of friction, but also of resilience, ingenuity, commercial energy, and really under-recognized strategic importance. And one of the enduring problems is that too much of the outside world still sees Africa in broad strokes, while those who work here know it's must be read with much finer detail. And that gap between this broad perception and lived reality, of course, carries a cost. It affects our valuations, it affects confidence, it affects investor appetite, it affects funding costs, and it affects how quickly opportunities move from conversations to execution. And I think nowhere is this actually clearer than in the question of the Africa risk premium. Now, again, let's be clear. I'm not saying that there isn't a risk, and I'm denying risk. I think the Africa risk is real. Yes, we've got there are sovereigns under pressure. There are refinancing walls. There are businesses exposed to currency volatility. There are infrastructure bottlenecks. There are governance pressures in some markets. There are legal, tax, regulatory frictions that really matter deeply. But and we see this too if we look at the Africa Development Bank noted that interest payments 2025, I think, were consuming about 27% or 28% of government's revenue across Africa, and this is up from 19% in 2019. We also know just earlier this month, the S&P also noted that African sovereigns are expected to borrow about $155 billion in long-term commercial debt, and much of that is shaped by refinancing needs and fiscal pressure. So yes, the risk is real, but the more important question is Africa always being priced with enough differentiation? And in my view, too often the answer is no. Too often Africa is still treated not as 54 countries, multiple regulatory environments, different institutional capabilities and capacities, with varying market depths and vastly different business quality profiles, but really as one broad category, one shorthand, one bucket list. And when that happens, this premium becomes distorted, because again, one sovereign event can color a sentiment towards multiple unrelated markets. One restructuring can widen caution well beyond its own borders. One political disruption can reduce appetite across jurisdictions, so that share very little beyond that actually share very little in common beyond just geographical location. And this is not always based on rigorous analysis, but it's very often a broad brush discount that applies. And of course, this matters because when risk is generalized before it's properly differentiated, strong businesses end up carry this reputational burden of weaker peers. Good projects pay for old assumptions. Reforming markets are still judged by outdated narratives, and companies that are doing the difficult work of strengthening governance, improving transparency, and building resilience can still be priced through a wider this wider continental shorthand. And this is why I think the Africa risk premium is not only a market issue, it's also a perception issue, a trust issue, a governance issue, a data issue, and a capability issue. And I think importantly, a professional services and financial financial professional issue. Of course, this goes beyond that. You can also view this from a leadership perspective. Um, the reason this is the issue because we see what narrows a premium over time is not the argument alone, but it's really the evidence. So evidence of governance, evidence of reporting, evidence in institutional behavior, evidence in management quality, evidence in discipline in which capital is allocated, evidence in how risk is understood, structured, and communicated. So, in other words, what narrows the premium is trust, and trust is built, not declared. What makes this even more important is that some of the data increasingly is challenging that myth. And we saw the Africa Development Bank argued in 2025 that the Africa risk premium is in many respects this costly myth, citing that infrastructure loss rates in Africa were about 1.5% versus much higher levels seen in Latin America and Eastern Europe. And Brookings also has similarly noted that default rates on infrastructure investments in Africa have been among the lowest in the world, around 2.6%, where the others are way north of 6%. Now, of course, this doesn't mean that the market is irrational to price risk, but it means that the market often applies a broad premium faster than it applies granular understanding. So some of the premium is earned, some of the premium is inherited, some of it's important for wider global risk cycles, and some of it reflects a market that is still under analysis, under analyzed across Africa, or then overgeneralized. And again, that to me is where the opportunity really lies, because Africa's response to this cannot simply be frustration. It has to be better positioning. And that begins with reading Africa's macro story with much greater maturity. So the continent is not moving at one speed. Its regions are different. Its sectors are different. Its opportunity sets are different. Its institutional depth is different. We again know that Africa is likely to grow by about 4.5% in 2026, with the continent continuing to outperform many other regions, even with the global uncertainty. East Africa continues to show the power of corridor thinking, infrastructure development, logistics, agriculture, services, regional connectivity. West Africa remains really central to the continent's long-term economic architecture because of its scale, entrepreneurial depth, trade routes, consumer markets, and industrial potential. North Africa matters not only in its own right, but it's a strategic bridge into Europe, Middle East, and Mediterranean production systems. Central Africa remains more uneven, and often more resource-led, but it still contains major upside where governance, infrastructure, and market access can improve. And then, of course, Southern Africa, even when slower in aggregate growth, it remains disproportionately important because of the financial system, legal infrastructure, corporate depth, industrial base, mining ecosystems, and again also your regional influence. So Africa's future cannot only be read as a sovereign risk story; it has to be read as a regional story, a corridor story, a value chain story, and a market build story. And I think this brings me to what I think is one of the most important and underappreciated themes of the continent, and this is intra-Africa trade. Because in a world where global trade is fragmented, where supply chains are being redesigned, where resilience now matters more than and as much as efficiency, Africa is both an opportunity and an imperative. It must trade more with itself, not eventually, but now with urgency. And that is why the Africa Continental Free Trade Area Agreement matters so much. It's not merely a policy initiative, it's not merely a diplomatic achievement, and it should not remain merely an aspiration. It's one of the most important strategic platforms available to the continent because its real promise lies not only in tariff reductions, its real promise lies in enabling different economic architectures, one of which more value is created within Africa, more goods is processed in Africa, more services are traded within Africa, and more supply chains are built across the African corridor. Year two, the World Bank estimates that if fully implemented, the Africa Continental Free Trade Area could raise incomes by about 9% by 2035, lifting 50 million people out of extreme poverty and increasing exports by up to 32% and boosting inter-Africa exports by 109%, with manufacturing being among the biggest beneficiaries of that. Just as context, Africa intertrade currently is about 15%. If you compare that to Europe, where it's about 70%, we can see where that opportunity lies. You see significant upswing if this takes place, where the opportunity for increasing into Africa exports, specifically also manufactured goods, which accounts for the majority of that, can lead to additional 260 billion rand or dollars in value for the continent. And of course, this is significant because, again, far too long Africa's economic pattern has been too familiar. Export raw material outward, import finished value inward. And the model was not serviced, hasn't served the continent well. Africa's next phase of development will require more value to be financed, processed, produced, moved, and scaled within the continent itself. And this means regional supply chains, more trade finance, more standards being aligned, more interoperable systems, more logistics capability, more corridor infrastructure, digital systems, and more institutions capable of supporting businesses across borders. Now, to my mind, this is one of the greatest strategic opportunities of our time, not just growth in Africa, but growth through African integration. And when we look at sectors through that lens, the opportunity becomes much more tangible. Energy is one of the clearest examples. Africa's energy gap remains one of the continent's greatest constraints, but it's also one of the greatest opportunities. Nearly 600 million people in Africa still live without access to electricity, and this is the development challenge. But it's also an enormous infrastructure, financing, and productivity opportunity. Power generation, transmission, embedded energy storage, they are all enablers of competitiveness. Then, of course, agriculture and agro-processing are equally important. Agriculture in Africa is not only about food security, it's also a trade issue, logistics issue, climate issue, processing issue, and ultimately an industrialization issue. We look at manufacturing and industrial value chains. They also matter deeply. If Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement is to become real in practical terms, it must show up in pharmaceutical packaging, in chemicals, in construction material, automotive systems, textiles, consumer goods, industrial inputs. In other words, in sectors where value can be retained and scaled inside the continent. Now, of course, digital infrastructure and fintech is another major level of opportunity. Africa's growth is not just about technology, but it's about reducing friction. It's about widening access. It's about payments, connectivity, data systems, and the ability to make the market work better across border. Year two, there's some estimates that mobile technologies can services generate about 220 billion of economic value in 2024, equivalent to sort of 7.7% of GDP, and that could increase to 270 by 2030. And then, of course, there's logistics and infrastructure. Trade agreements don't move goods. Your systems do. And this is where ports, roads, rail, warehousing, border posts, customs processes, trade documents, payment rails, standardizing systems. That's the real plumbing of integration. And this is what requires a deep focus. And then finally, financial services. I think Africa's future depends not only on raising more capital, but also building more repeatable and resilient markets. Local currency financing, debt markets, debt market development, trade finance, insurance, credit, intermediation, syndicated loans, etc. Again, consistent, all part of this continent's long-term architecture of value creation. And this is where financiers and a finance lens becomes important. Because again, when I look at Africa, it's not only we don't only see a capital shortage, but I really see an architecture challenge. And the question is not simply how do we bring more capital in? The deeper question is how do we build systems, confidence, and institutional depth so that capital can move more efficiently, move more repeatedly, and more productively? And that's a very different question. And it requires a different kind of leadership. It requires companies to position themselves differently. The era of relying on broad narrative is over. It's no longer enough to say Africa's young, growing, and digitizing, and Africa's urbanizing. Those things are all true, yes, but capital doesn't invest in slogans. Capital invests in clarity. It invests in businesses with governance that is it can understand, numbers it can trust, cash flows it can analyze, management teams it can back, risk it can map, strategies that still make sense when conditions become harder. So, in other words, capital is not looking for perfection, but is looking for legibility. And many businesses, frankly, are still carrying not only an external Africa premium, but an internal premium of their own making. A premium created by weak systems, poor reporting, messy ownership structures, unclear tax positions, underdeveloped governance, reactive strategy, insufficient preparation, and limited succession thinking. And that internal premium matters because even in difficult market, businesses that reduce ambiguity, reduce friction, businesses that improve legibility, improve fundability. Businesses that strengthen governance improve that optionality. The strongest African companies, in my view, will not necessarily be those operating in the easiest environments, but it'll be those that are best able to make risk understandable, governable, and financeable. They will show discipline, they will show resilience, they will show strategic focus, and will build trust before they need it. And that brings me to, I think, from this perspective, from a finance professional perspective, but also then just generally from a leadership point of view, where a big role needs to play. For many years, if you look at finance professionals' roles, and I'm using the term finance professional quite broadly, for many years, the role has been defined very narrowly: reporting, compliance, assurance, review, technical integration. Now, all of these still remain essential, but it's no longer enough. Clients today don't don't need only technical answers, but they need what I would call a confidence architecture. And they need help to becoming more investable, more resilient, more scalable, more governable, more legible to capital. And that means the role of your audit firm, the role of your tax advisor, the role of your finance leader is evolving. The role of the advisory network is evolving. We're no longer only interpreters of what has happened. Increasingly, we are part of what makes value possible. And that's where also, if you look at wider conversations happening in professions, including communities like CMA, CEPA, etc., becomes so relevant because finance is no longer being asked only to record performance. Finance is increasingly being asked to shape decision quality, to improve transparency, to support resilience, to connect reporting to strategy, to strengthen governance, to enable long-term value creation. And this is a much broader mandate. And in Africa, where trust is still a fragile in information asymmetry can be high, that broader mandate becomes even more important. Because again, here, professional credibility can materially affect whether a business is trusted, whether a transaction is progressed, whether an investor leans in, whether a lender gets comfortable, whether a strategy becomes executable. In that environment, the finance professional and financial professional firms does not sit outside the value creation process, but it becomes part of that infrastructure of confidence. It helps clients to move from founder lending to institutions to institutional grade governance. It helps them prepare for growth, succession, M&A, restructuring, regional expansion, capital raising. It helps them link reporting to confidence, governance to valuation, tax to durability, systems to scale, and strategy to execution. And that does not weaken the finance professional's role or the profession's role, or their integrity, but it deepens their relevance. And this matters much because, again, the opportunity is not simply to be present across many jurisdictions. The opportunities to become more useful across them, to help clients think regionally, not only nationally, to reduce friction in cross-border activity, to connect the right expertise, to bring the tax, the audit, advisory, restructuring, transaction ability into one coherent client journey, to support businesses that want to grow into new corridors, to help mid-market firms move more to become more capital ready, to strengthen trust with investors, lenders, and counterparties who need credible insight on the ground. Because in Africa, networks are not peripheral, they're part of the infrastructure of trust. And a fragmented environment, trusted network becomes a strategic asset. So Africa does not need less realism. It needs better differentiation. We should not deny the risk. We should understand. We should understand it more precisely, price them more intelligently, mitigate them more deliberately, and stop allowing weak generation generalization to stand in for serious analysis. But of course, equally, we should be more confident in recognizing what Africa truly is, not simply a long-term demographic story, but a present tense value creation story, a trade story, an energy story, a digital story, a regional integration story, an industrial story, a market building story. So the question is whether we will be building the institutional capability, professional confidence, and cross-border partnerships needed to unlock this. And this is why the call before us is not merely commercial, but it's truly one of stewardship. For companies, the call is to 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 build investability. For investors, the call is to differentiate more intelligently. For policymakers, the call is to reduce friction and strengthen the plumbing of the markets. For professional firms, the call is to expand that mandate, to move beyond describing complexity and help clients navigate it, to move beyond compliance as an endpoint and treat it as a platform, to move beyond national silos and embrace corridor partnership thinking, and network thinking. And for all of us as finance professionals and financiers, including those, if I think about the work that the likes of CIMA, SIPA, and CASA, etc., is doing, the call is to recognize that the value creation in the next era will be inseparable from trust creation, because the next phase of growth will not be unlocked by capital alone, but it'll be unlocked by confidence, by credibility, by institutional quality, by integration, by stronger partnerships, and by professionals willing to help close that gap between what Africa is and what too much of the world still assumes it is. And this is the work in front of us, the opportunity in front of us. And this is where leaders, finance professionals, and various other stakeholders can play a crucial role. Once again, thanks for listening, and hope you found this insightful.